All right, we are in Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8. We're looking at the ram and the he-goat. And almost worked our way through the vision itself, and then we will move toward the interpretation. So let's begin reading and just remind ourselves where we are, and then we will just progress forward. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel," which we talked about last week. He might have been transplanted there, or his body in a vision. It's not uncommon for you to be transported to places. So whether he's literally there or not, it's a discussion that can it can be had, but we're not going to go into it too far. It says, "Which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the mightier one came up last." And we talked about this, of course, representing the kingdoms of Media and Persia and how they were united, and one was stronger than the other. It says, "I saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was none who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great." And so this is the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire, which is the interpretation that we are given later on in the chapter. So obviously we're very confident in that interpretation. So there's the rise of the Medes and the Persians. Then we see the rise of the Greek Empire. It says, "I was considering, and behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground." That is his speed. His feet never touched the ground. "And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in powerful wrath. And I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one that could rescue the ram from his power." And we talked about Alexander's vendetta against the Medo-Persian Empire because of their invasion of Greece years before, which has ties to, I don't want to retrace it all, has ties to the events of Esther chapter 1. So, it says, "Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." So Alexander dies at a very young age. He becomes king at 20 and dies at the age of just shy of 33. So he's 32. And so it doesn't take him long. It takes him about 3 years to conquer the world superpower in Medo-Persia. And so he has a swift rise. That's the goat, his feet not touching the ground. And then in his strength, he is broken, and then the kingdom just dissolves. Not dissolves in the sense that it doesn't continue to exist, but it has no centralized leader. The next ensuing years are going to be nothing but chaos. And so, let's see. He would have been the late 300s. So for the next 150 years or so, 200 years, is going to be nothing but infightings between the 2 main families, the 2 main branches that will preoccupy Daniel's attention and our attention is the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemy Empire. And they're the ones that go to war with each other continuously, and Israel kind of stands between them. And so Israel gets caught in the crosshairs between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, okay? And so they are of central importance. Now, in verse 9, it says, "And out of one of them came a little horn, and grew exceedingly great toward the south, the east, and toward the glorious land." The glorious land, of course, is Palestine. It says, "It grew so great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them." And so Last week we identified this little horn that grows and becomes powerful as the most notorious enemy of the Jews in the Intertestament period. And his name is Antiochus IV. And he called himself Epiphanes, which is manifest God. He considered himself to be God manifest in the flesh. Epiphany is a word that means an appearance, a manifestation, especially a divine manifestation. That's not necessarily the way we use it, but its origins are there. Even this word is used of Jesus in Titus 2, looking for and waiting for his glorious appearing, his epiphania. Okay? So here he is, and he takes over, and he becomes a hostile enemy to the Jewish people. And so it says he grows great, and some of the host of the stars he threw down to the ground. So rising to the stars. This is a common imagery in apocalyptic literature. The rulers are many times referred to as the stars or the celestial beings, not because they're divine, but because just think about it from simple human standards. I mean, you're living in a culture that's never explored outer space. What is the highest you can go? When you look up, it's the sky. And so that becomes a metaphor for people who have reached the highest of positions. And so he himself, the point is that Antiochus rises to a high position of power, and then he overthrows some of the other hosts. The other stars are thrown down to the ground and trampled on. And so if he is there amongst the elites and he throws down some of those stars, well, that's him throwing down other leaders. Okay? And so it's not overly complicated. It's just stopping for a minute to think of the imagery and what's going on. And so he rises through sleight of hand, and we'll see some of that in the interpretation of this. It says, he became great, even as great as the prince of the host, and the regular burnt offering was taken away. So the prince of the host, his identity is not exactly certain. Some people think it's talking about God. Some people think it's talking about an archangel. And some people think it's talking about the high priest in Israel, which he will have a hand in convoluting the priesthood in Israel. Whichever one, there's a case to be made for all three, and I'm just not sure which one it is, to be honest with you. But the point being, he's rising very high, and he started to think about this, what those three groups have in common. Whether you're talking about God, or you're talking about archangels, or you're talking about the priesthood, you're dealing in a divine realm. Not that the high priest is divine, but he represents the divine. So you're dealing in a realm that is very high, okay? And so if you try and rise up against the divine, you're trying to overthrow them. And so the prophets many times will use this imagery of trying to build and make their home in the stars because they're trying to dethrone God in their way of understanding and thinking. And so Antiochus does that, and then we see some things here. It says, and the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown. That is, Antiochus, there was a regular burnt offering that took place every morning and every evening. From the time that Israel erected the tabernacle, all throughout history, they made their sacrifices in the morning and in the evening. And that kind of kept them in good standing with God. There were other sacrifices certainly throughout the day, but those two. And so it says his place and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. So one of the things Antiochus is going to do, and we're going to read about him and hear about him more and more, especially when we get to the vision of chapters 10 through 12. So one of the things Antiochus is going to do, and what he's most notoriously known for, is what Daniel calls the abomination of desolation, okay, which Jesus picks up on in the New Testament when he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, know that the time is near. Now, what that has reference to is Antiochus wasn't content just to rule over them, he wanted to lord over them. And so in lording over them, he caused the sacrificial system to be cut off. He had a gymnasium built, which a gym is a very Greek thing. Okay, it was a symbol of Greek culture. But they had, and when you read in the books of the Maccabees, which are not inspired books, but they offer historical insight and value. He was very hostile against circumcision. I don't know what's involved in this, and to be honest with you, I'm not really interested in studying it much further. Is that a number of the men, he encouraged their circumcisions to be reversed. Okay? I didn't know that was possible, and I don't want to know any more about it. But basically, what he was trying, and the reason why they wanted the circumcision reversed was in the gymnasio, the word itself carries with it the idea of nakedness or nudity, because they exercise naked. Okay? And so the reason you would want that reversed is because people could see a man's circumcision and know that he was not Greek, he was Jewish, and so that would cause prejudicial issues. And so he would encourage them to reverse those types of markers. So he's trying to assimilate them into Greek culture and force them to become Greek, which was Alexander's whole point in taking over the world, was to spread the Hellenistic or the Greek way of life. And so, but anyway, the abomination of desolation in particular is this. He goes in and he goes into the most holy place to offer a sacrifice on the altar, which, first of all, obviously, he's not qualified to do. All right? He's not Jewish. He's certainly not a Levite, and he's certainly not of the tribe or the family of Aaron, so he has no right to offer. And then he offers a pig. What's significant about offering a pig? It's an unclean animal. All right? So he takes all these different Jewish laws and just as offensive as he can be, that's what he does. Okay? And so he offers that sow on the altar of burnt offering, and that will lead, and we'll talk more about that here in just a minute, that will lead to a revolt known as the Maccabean Revolt. So in verse 12 it says, "And the host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act, and it will prosper." So he says he's going to throw truth to the ground. Now there are two possible meanings of what he has in mind here. Throwing truth to the ground. One of the things we know from reading First Maccabees is that not only did Antiochus do all these other things, but in the process, he also demanded that all copies of the law be burned. Okay, so they went in confiscating and then burning the copies of the Torah, of the law of Moses. And so some people think when he says he'll throw truth to the ground, that's what he means. That may be what he means, but I don't think that's exactly what he means. There's an image in the prophets that if truth is thrown to the ground, that means truth was once where? If it's thrown down, it was once sitting where? High, right? So truth was held up as something to be valued, and it being thrown on the ground where you can walk on it and trample it means you devalue truth, okay? And so there's a similar text in Isaiah 59, verses 14 and 15. And so the point being that truth kind of became expendable, and he became prosperous in what he did. His takeover worked. It worked. Then in verse 13 it says, "Then I heard the Holy One speaking, and another Holy One had said to the one who spoke." And so this Holy One, if you remember back to chapter 4 with Nebuchadnezzar's vision of hearing the Holy Ones, we're talking about angels who are watching this transpire in the vision. And so one angel looks at another and says, "For how long is this vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary of the host to be trampled underfoot?" Okay? So how long is the offering going to be cut off and the temple be stripped of its Jewishness and all of the things that take place? How long is that going to last? That is a common question in apocalyptic language, because in apocalyptic literature, many times you're facing persecution. And so one of the questions we ask as human beings when we suffer or when we struggle is, how much longer is this going to last? Okay? It's a very common question. You see it in Zechariah chapter 1. You see it in Revelation 6, one of the seals that are opened. You have those who've been martyred, and they're asking God, how long? How long are they going to continue to get away with this before you make them pay the penalty for their sin against us? And so the question they want to know is, how long is all this persecution going to last? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful place. So 2,300 evenings and mornings. So let's talk about the 2,300 for just a second. So when we're interpreting that, there are a couple of schools of thought. One is 2,300 evening and mornings means basically split 2,300 in half. So you're talking about 1,150 days. The other school of thought, which is the one I'm more inclined to read this as, is that you're talking about literal days, 2,300 days. And the reason I say that is because when you look in Genesis chapter 1, you remember at the end of each day it says there was evening and there was morning the first day or the second day. So for a day, you need an evening and a morning. It doesn't make sense in my mind to say, oh, evening and morning, so that's 2 days? No, by normal calculations, that's just one. So 2,300 days, you're dealing with roughly 6.5 years. Okay? If we're even supposed to be interpreting this super literally, which I'm not confident that that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. But if we were, historically speaking, this is what it would mean. So Antiochus and some of the individuals involved with him, they ordered the murder of Onias III, and that led, he was the high priest at the time, and that led to all this chaos at the temple. Okay? Then, so after all this transpires in the temple, then you have what is known as the Maccabean Revolt. And the reason it's known as the Maccabean Revolt is because that was their name, the Maccabees. Okay? So Judas Maccabeus, his sons, individuals along those lines, they led a rebellion. Okay? They were priestly, if I remember correctly. And so they led a rebellion and overthrew Greek power in Jerusalem. Now, this is a process. This is a years-long process. They turn to guerrilla warfare. They go and they hide out. They have strengths and weaknesses. But for a short period of time anyway, they create a certain sense of freedom. Now, what holiday do they celebrate to commemorate this? It still happens today. It's still on your calendar. It's Hanukkah. Okay? That's what Hanukkah is talking about. It's about the restoration of the temple under the Maccabean Revolt. They celebrated it even in the days of Jesus. Look at, just a second, John chapter 10. In John chapter 10 and verse 22, it says, at that time, the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the colonnade of Solomon. The feast of dedication is Hanukkah. Okay? So this was one of the feasts that was set up in remembrance of that. And so they see an end to the reign of Antiochus is what it is. So he rises, he creates all kinds of chaos. There's a rebellion against him, and then the people of God prevail. That's the general notion. Whether we understand and can connect all the history, that all can be done. Believe me, you can read and connect those dots. That can be done. But the basic premise, even of all these prophecies and all of their details, the basic premise of each one is there's this person who rises up against the people of God. He makes their life miserable, but ultimately he doesn't prevail. Okay? Now, in this context, just by way of another tidbit, so There are a lot of questions and honestly a lot of statements going on right now and circulating about the end of time and end times and all these things that happen anytime there's a war anywhere, but especially if Israel is involved. And Israel is involved in one. So, people say, where did all that start? Well, so the teaching most prominent in evangelical churches, well, most evangelical churches. Presbyterian are evangelical, but they're not premillennial. It's called premillennialism, or a special form known as dispensational premillennialism. Okay? Now, premillennialism, this idea that Jesus is going to rapture the church and take them off to heaven for 7.5 years while there's war and tribulation, or for 3.5 years while there's war and tribulation, and then he's going to return and set up his kingdom, and they're going to reign for 1,000 years, and whole lot of things. Okay. So when people think of that, that's what's being circulated right now. Any social media site, that's what you're going to see. Okay, there are a couple observations I want to make about it. Number one, the world of New Testament scholarship, and Old Testament scholarship for that matter, on the whole, looks at premillennialism now and says, it's got 1,000 errors in it. There's no way we can believe it. Okay? This is not, what I'm trying to tell you is this is not solely a Church of Christ view of premillennialism. There are people in Methodist churches. David De Silva, a New Testament scholar at Asbury Theological Seminary, is very critical of this premillennial notion. His book on Revelation is tremendous. And so, first of all, it has fallen into serious disfavor, because what happens is, and people say, well, I don't care about scholars. Well, you should, because eventually you will start hearing what they're thinking. Your kids especially will start hearing what they're thinking. Okay? So, in the world of scholarship, it's highly been rejected, and I suspect probably within the next 50 to 100 years, it will be all but a few people who hold to it anymore. The second thing is, how did all this get started? How did it get so popular? Because it's a relatively new teaching. It's a 19th century development, so 1800s. So there is one man, and one of my teachers that I had in school for current religious teachings, he said, this is the most significant theologian that nobody has ever heard of, because his beliefs have impacted and affected all of these misunderstandings concerning premillennialism and other things that are similar to it. Now, why do I bring it up here? Well, because that theologian's name was William Miller. And he predicted, based upon this text, that the world would end on October 22nd of 1844. Based on this text. Okay? Now, obviously, the reason why you don't know anything about him, well, obviously, first, he wasn't right. And because he wasn't right so publicly, people stopped listening to him. But his understanding of how you read apocalyptic language like Daniel and Revelation was adopted by countless people, Seventh-day Adventists to be precise. Other individuals came along. It found its way into one of the most famous study Bibles in history, and I don't think necessarily famous in a good way, but the Scofield Study Bible put these premillennial notes into it, and thus people began to take it, and people began to believe it everywhere. So, isn't it interesting? that the reason we are where we are now on a current religious landscape, and if I were to walk in to a lot of churches and tell them, Israel is not God, they are no longer God's chosen people, that a great number of people, the majority of people who heard me say that, would be offended and think that I was corrupting what the Bible says. Or if I told them that the rapture is something that's not going to happen, they would be offended by that. Now people say, well, I don't care about scholars and I don't care about all these other people. Listen, a scholar sitting alone in his office one day sat down and mapped out all of this theory, which now finds its way into the American fabric of culture so deeply that most people won't even entertain the notion that it's wrong. Because he was studying the same text we're studying tonight and took the 2,300 evenings and mornings and said, oh, that's 2,300 years. And so if I start from there and I trace it forward, I can know when the end is coming. Well, one of the things we're going to see in just a minute is the end being spoken of here is not talking about the end of the world. It doesn't make sense contextually. So, Daniel is being shown that his people, long after he is dead, they're going to face some serious opposition. Okay? Antiochus, but at the end of the day, he will not prevail. All right? So, let's move then to the interpretation and its effects on Daniel. It says, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, most likely an angelic figure. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, the canal where he was. It called Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Gabriel, of course, one of the two angels we know by name all throughout Scripture. The old Jewish tradition is that there were 7 archangels, and that comes from this Old Testament pseudepigraphal book called First Enoch. First Enoch chapter 20, they developed the idea of 7 archangels. Now notice, pseudepigraphal, pseudo, false, pigraphal writings, false writings. Gabriel is notoriously mentioned again. He's going to be mentioned again in this book, but Luke chapter 1 is where he reappears a couple of times when he announces the birth of, or the pregnancy of John the Baptist, and then also of Jesus, their conception. So here's Gabriel, and the voice is calling to Gabriel, saying, make this man understand the vision. So he came near to where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end. Okay? So 2 things here. 1, I have heard and interacted with quite a few people in my life who have told me that God spoke to them or God appeared to them. And I'm in no way challenging or questioning their sincerity in that or their belief in that. What I am saying is there seems to be an inconsistency. When I asked them, what was it like? Just explain it to me. And they talk about the calmness and the peace of it and how comforting it was. The problem is when you look throughout Old and New Testaments and you look at what are called theophanies, that is, appearances of God. There it is, epiphany, theos, God, phone, epiphany, the appearances of God. On the whole, they're pretty terrifying. It's not like this comforting thing where you're thinking, oh, you remember the voice of God at Sinai? He gives the 10 Commandments, and the people's response is what? Please stop talking. We are scared to death. Daniel is going to pass smooth out, and when the vision is over, he's going to spend the next couple of days in bed because it is so overwhelming and enthralling. Okay? So there's a consistency issue we need to think about there. The second is these words about that the vision is for the time of the end. So what does he mean, the time of the end? How are most people going to read that? End of time, because he's talking about the end. But look, the equivalent of looking at a book in Daniel and saying, this is talking about the end of time, is the equivalent of me picking up a book and saying, every time I see the word end, it's going to definitely be talking about the end of time. Now, I may be reading a novel where he says he went around the end of the car. Oh, he's talking about the end of time. No, he's talking about the end of the car. So in the context, Daniel has just seen this grand vision and how this guy is going to cause great havoc for the people of Israel. And the question that was asked by the angels in the vision was, how long? And then he's told how long. So what does the end have reference to? The vision. He's not talking about the end of the world. It's not even on his radar. He's talking about a time in history. As a matter of fact, in this window, he's talking about a 6.5-year time of history. When will this end? We've got to show him the time of the end. And so that's why it becomes absolutely imperative to force ourselves to think contextually. And also why I am such a strong believer in understanding the Old Testament, because without it we botch the new. And we read the new back on the old, and we force interpretations that don't belong. Okay? So, in verse 18, he begins the interaction. When he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face on the ground. But he touched me and made me stand up. So Daniel sees him and he goes flat out. And he said, that is, Gabriel says, behold, I will make known to you what will be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. The latter end of the indignation, the latter end, the appointed time of the end. Again, interpreting within the contextual flow. Okay? So it would appear then that what is happening to the Jews by Antiochus, it would appear that that is God's judgment on the Jews for being unfaithful in that time period. It would appear. That's certainly the way they interpret it. When you read 2 Maccabees, they interpreted Antiochus' actions against them as God's judgment on them, the same way that God used Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon to punish them. Okay? So, but the time of that punishment is over. It says in verse 20, and as for the ram that you saw with 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. And the goat, that's the king of Greece. And the great horn between the eyes is the first king. Okay? So that just goes to set in concrete what we said in the first part of the interpretation. He's telling us. And as for the horn that was broken, and in place of which 4 arose, and 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power, that is, the Greek empire splits and splinters. It says, and at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. He'll have great power, though not his own, and he'll cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does. So what are we reading? We're reading the exact same thing about Antiochus again. We read it the first time in the vision, and now he's giving us a fuller understanding. And so we're going to pause there and pick that up next week, and then move into 9. Okay? Any questions or anything? I didn't get any on my phone. Any questions or anything before we finish?